All right, so welcome to the CS390 Room Piracy Edition. Start with the quiz as usual. This should be from the video, pre-lecture video. All right, so answer to that, by the way, is, 19. VGG 19. Yep, it's identifiably because it's much bigger than AlexNet was, and it has 19 conf layers instead of the 16 you'll get with VGG 16. And it doesn't have any weird stuff like GoogleNet or ResNet does, because they have all the little weird off-juts and special operations and everything. But we'll talk a little bit more about those today if you are not remembering the video. Okay, so today we're talking about implementing neural nets as well, or as conf nets, as well as some notable conf nets that have been used in the past for image processing tasks. Lab 1 is due, or the first lab is due today, so just get that in before the midnight or whatever. And then lab 2 is officially started last week, but by the end of today, you'll have everything you need to really get through that one pretty fast, I think. So, all right, so just like we had before, where Keras is just incredibly easy. It just lets you, it has all of the stuff to make it pretty simple to figure out. You have all the convolutional stuff too. You have conf2d, max pooling, dropout, flatten, in case you want to bring it down to being a flat array again later. Dense layers to put at the end, just like you used already. You have all of those layers already at your disposal, and just using those 5 operations there, you can make a conf net. So let's walk through this simple one here. We have this simple conf net. It doesn't have any sort of special things, no dropout, nothing like that. It has input shape being the height, the width, and the depth of the image. Depth, of course, is our color channels. So we create our model, first of all. It's important. We need to set some parameters. Our input shape that we talked about before, we need to have a loss type or loss function, just like any other neural net. And our optimizer, Atom optimizer. I think I talked about this last time, but or last time we were working with Keras a lot. Atom is just a specialized gradient descent. It has some extra parts to it, but it is vaguely the same thing that you did with your neural networks, where your custom neural networks, where it's doing that back propagation. Next, we're going to add a little block of 2 convolutions and a pooling. How you want to do this is up to you, but you can have several blocks and then several convolutions and a pooling, 1 convolution and a pooling. It can very much affect the performance of the network, but that's kind of a trial and error thing. The 2 to 3 usually seems to work pretty well before a pooling. Doing 1 to 1 is generally not advisable. We also have, you can see right there, the 32 and the 64. That is the number of filters we're going to be running per this convolution. So the output volume is going to be the kernel size that we set there, times the depth of the number of filters. So, we're going to have 9 times 32 outputs for the first one and 9 times 64 outputs for the second one. And both of them are going to include a ReLU activation. Remember these convolutional steps where each of these filter movements is still just 1 neuron basically, and it still has the whole process of getting the dot product, the summing the product, and then pool size is just how we're gonna split up the pool, of course. In this case, we're in 2x2 blocks. Yep. Gotta do that, but yep. Give all the dimensions. After that, in this one, we're just going, because it's just a simple one, we're going to immediately flatten it down. And at this point, it's just a normal neural network again. It is, we can use our fully connected layers. It's just one tensor, 1D tensor instead of being a multi-dimensional thing. And we can use our fully connected layers with our ReLU and our softmax again. And finally, compile everything, fit everything, output the model. And that is all it takes in Keras to build a ConvNet. Not too bad. It's definitely, most of the work for this is going to be tuning, and including other things like dropout, data augmentation's nice, but there's a lot of peripheral work, but the core of it is just knowing how to use these few objects. A lot of extra options, both in the function. There are each of the different functions. There are lots and lots of arguments that are optional that I didn't specify. You can use the different optimizers, different loss functions. Definitely experiment with it. We have a neat little one called layer called Lambda, where you can actually, it's just a wrapper for a Python function, and you can use that function as a layer. So if you wanted to do something fancy, have some sort of like, oh, I'd like to negate everything or something, or find the square root of everything at some point, the square of something at some point. I don't know why you want to. You could probably, there's probably some case when it would be pretty useful, but it's a way to customize it a little more and give it a little more of your own functionality. We also have these two links. I'm not going to go over them exhaustively, but we have just a bunch of different types of conv layers and a bunch of different types of pooling layers. The conv ones, as far as the image processing goes, I don't know if there's going to be all that much use in using ones besides 2D conv, maybe 3D conv if you're doing like, if you want to like see how the colors interact or something. Pooling, though, definitely look into those, because while max pooling tends to be the best, it's not the only option. There's a lot of different types of pooling you can do. Or again, you can do something like increasing the stride, like we talked about in the last lecture, where that one paper was able to show that just increasing the stride of the network over time made pooling less necessary. So from there, we'll talk about some notable architectures. First of all, AlexNet. This is the one, I think we talked about this briefly at the very start of the year. This was the revolutionary first CNN that showed that CNNs could be really good at image processing. It was designed by a student, PhD student, and it competed in the 2012 ImageNet Large-Scale Visualization Recognition Challenge, and it did better than anyone else there. It won it. It had around 60 million different weights it had to deal with, but it was the most effective image processing or image classification specifically system that has ever been made at the time. That was in 2012, yeah. A little bit about it. It took 256 by 256 RGB images. They were also resized and cropped. There's, I think, an extra credit for you guys to do that on the lab, but there's a nice, you won't have to try to figure out the logic for that yourself. It's, you might have to go digging through Keras documentation, but it's in there. It can make things a lot easier. But would randomly resize and crop the images. The image images were grayscale, it would turn them into RGB by just mirroring the values for all of them. And that's kind of pre-processing it went through. But after the random crops, it would end up taking images of 227 by 227, and that is the actual input size of the network. That's the input going in. But that cropping, of course, is just another form of data augmentation that lets us look at things from different angles or having different amounts of noise, and makes us a little more competent on our training set and hopefully also on our testing set. So here's a bit of a visual graphic view of what this network would look like. Anytime you see the blocks there, consider that the output volume. So, except the first one, that's the image itself, but the orange ones are all output volumes. We do, as you can see, several convolutions and poolings, different numbers of filters for each one, and they're all described, all the specifics of each step are described there. And as you can see, the output is shrinking over time, but the number of outputs is increasing. Until eventually, we end up flattening it and using 2 fully connected layers as well as softmax at the end. And that does a pretty good job of identifying the images. Again, that's working by, over time, over parts of the network, we get more and more abstract shapes. We start with our early shapes at the end that are just like small lines and very little tiny features in the image. And as we go on, we get things more like the texture of the image. We might get actual shapes found in the image, like more complex shapes. Yeah. VGG was an Oxford designed CNN. There are 2 versions, a 16 layer one and a 19 layer one. Was the runner-up in the 2014 competition, same one as the ImageNet one. These ones had 138 million weights, or I think VGG19 specifically did. Nice thing about these, the weights are available for use online. So you can take this network pre-trained, and it's just been trained on a bunch of images. It's basically just knows the patterns found in lots and lots and lots of images. So if you take this and you apply it to another image, there's a good chance it's going to do okay just from that. And if you have to change the classes and such, but what you do is you start from this point instead of starting with randomly initialized values, and you can train the network from there. And we are going to be using, in fact, VGG19 for our style transfer lab and the starting weights for that. But more on that later. GoogleNet. So the reason that the capitalization is weird is because Google based their network off of something called LayNet. The main thing they added to it was something called the inception module, which it runs convolutions of different sizes through different paths, and can basically decide then which one's going to be the best. It still keeps all the outlets from all of them. But yeah, the interesting thing though, only about 4 million weights across the layers. This net definitely performs better than VGG, but it does so with far fewer weights to worry about, which means it's a lot faster to train, and it is a lot less computationally difficult. Weights are also available online. The reason we're not using something like this for style transfer is just because this is it has extra parts to it. It has the inception module, and then one of the best things about BGG for research is it's just a standard CNN. It just has our convolutions and our poolings and some fully connected layers at the end. Here's a little view of it. So it's kind of hard to see, and it had to be sideways, which is unfortunate, but we start here with a few actual just convolutions. Convolution, pooling, convolution, yeah. But eventually we get over here to the point where we're going to be using these kind of blocks here. Those are our inception layers. As you can see, there's different paths that the data can go down at the same time and have different numbers of convolutions, and then all of that information is pulled together and sent into the next one. That is an extremely effective neural network, but it's not the most effective we've come up with so far. And the next one I think is the most effective we've come up with. I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure it's the most effective one. Oh, yeah. First, a quick tangent though. We talked about vanishing gradient a little bit. So when we have many layers in a network, we know that as the gradient goes backwards, it usually gets smaller, right? That can be a problem because if we have a very, very deep network with lots and lots of layers, eventually the gradient is going to become so small that it doesn't count. It really doesn't do anything. And that is not something we want. Also a little note about this. Theoretically, if you were to take a simple flat neural net with one layer and you had enough neurons in it, as long as it has an output of neurons, well, it should be able to compute any function that any other neural network can. There's no reason it couldn't. The problem is we don't have infinite computation. The adding different layers makes these things incredibly more efficient. But again, we run into this problem. This is kind of a mathematical barrier to our having more layers. And as we multiply backward, and we eventually lose that gradient. And that's where ResNet comes in. Now, ResNet 2015, it blew everything out of the water with that with the ImageNet competition. It had a error rate of 3.57, which on ImageNet, which is huge, absolutely preposterous number of images. That's insane. That is higher than a human can do. They actually tested a human with this, and they were not able to get the same error rate as ResNet could. Now, ResNet tackles the vanishing gradient problem using something called residual blocks or skip connections. Basically, what it's allowing is a shortcut around certain layers. Now that seems counterintuitive, but it all stems from this idea that neural networks are not good at representing an identity function. So the basic idea, though, is we are passing forward our input through these different skip connection blocks, and therefore the neural part of it, in between the hidden layers in between, are just worried about modifying the input instead of creating the data themselves, basically. And that means the amount of change we're going to need for each layer is less, and then we can worry we can have much deeper networks before the vanishing gradient problem becomes an issue. So you definitely take a look at that on your own too. Especially if you're considering for your group project at the end, maybe doing something with ResNet, that would be interesting. But for right now, we'll move on. There we go. So a lot of links today, including that ResNet explanation video, but also papers on the original papers for every single one of the neural networks we looked at today. If you're interested in looking more into any of them, then definitely go ahead. The AlexNet one is particularly a good read. It is one of the most referenced papers in machine learning at this point. It's been referenced thousands and thousands of times, so good stuff. Next week, we're going to be looking a little more into the applications of these. We've covered how the CNNs work, we've covered how to make them, and now we're going to look at what we can do with them. Also, I think 2 more weeks left until lab 2 is due. Yep, 2 more weeks. I'm going to shut up, phone. I will also be sending you back your homeworks. If you want me to not do it over email, just tell me, I'll get it back to you in paper. That's fine too, but I'll definitely have your grades back at least for that soon. And I think that's it for today.